of Environment at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And I've been asked to give a short presentation, and I understand it may be shorter now, about PFAS, the forever chemical that you might have heard about in the news. And I just want to let you know this is purely informational today, and I want to make sure that you understand that there's a lot of questions that you may have that I might have to say I don't know, because this is new for Kansas. This has been an issue on the coast, the East Coast and the West Coast, and they've acted differently than we have in the middle of the country. But we are going to have to go down this path of PFAS contamination. And so I just want to give you some background information for right now. Do I have a clicker? All right. Which one is it? This one? All right. There it goes. All right, so PFAS. And there's many different chemicals that are in the PFAS range. It's a man-made chemical. We've been making it since the 50s, 60s time frame. And it was a wonderful chemical that we created. And there are thousands of different mixtures of PFAS chemicals. So we use PFAS as a catch-all for all the different chemicals that are out there. It's been estimated there are like 30,000 different PFAS chemicals. And so we are just now starting to dip our toes into the PFAS arena. What makes PFAS interesting is that there's a carbon-fluorine bond, and that bond is incredibly strong. You can't hardly get it broken. And therefore, because of that bonding of the fluorine to the carbon, these chemicals are persistent in our environment, and they last a long time, and they are hard to destroy. And like I said, these are what you'll hear in the news as the forever chemicals. Next one. Oh, I'm way off. All right, consumer products is where we find these. So some of the characteristics of these chemicals is that they repel oil and grease. They're a fire retardant. You can't burn them. So we throw them on fires to put fires out. And so like I mentioned earlier, at even high temperatures, they don't break down. Some of the names that you've heard probably and you use in your home is Stainmaster and Scotchgard that you put on your carpeting and furniture so that if you have a spill, it's easy to wipe off. I remember when my mother got her first Teflon pan to cook in. Teflon is a PFAS. It was the greatest thing. We didn't have as many burnt episodes as we had before. But it was a miracle chemical because you could get it really hot and nothing would stick to it. And like I said earlier, firefighters use it, especially on aircraft crashes, to put out anything that has fuel in it because it will suffocate the fire out. So AFFF is what that is called in the world out there. And most fire departments used and trained with AFFF, and especially at the airports. So, like I said, but we use it in many of our consumer products. Things like popcorn bags. It makes sense, right? You put popcorn into that, you put it in the microwave, you get it really hot, and it doesn't stick. Food wrappers, your hamburgers that you get, that piece of paper, it doesn't saturate up with grease because it's got this PFAS coating on it. So we have used these chemicals in our lives many, many different places. And there's a list here of the different places that we use these chemicals. And like I said, it was a miracle chemical when it first came out. So here's the concerns. We have gotten smarter about how we look at things. And we have found out that there are health effects from these chemicals. I'm not going to read all these to you, but the big one is at the bottom. There's a strong correlation between these chemicals and kidney cancer. So And you can tell that by the cleanup standards that the EPA has set is very low. It is in the parts per trillion, which is something we couldn't even measure a few years ago. So it's one of those toxic chemicals for our bodies, although we probably all have PFAS in us because we've used it so much around. So I want to talk a little bit about how circular this is, since it is so persistent in the environment. Industry has used these chemicals for 50 years, different aspects. We weren't monitoring these chemicals because they weren't regulated. No one was reporting on them. So they've been allowed to go out the stacks as emissions. They've been allowed to be discharged to the sewers. And they weren't a hazardous waste, so we weren't treating them like one. So that water goes to the wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater treatment plant treats the water. They weren't monitoring for it. They were just discharging it to the streams. The biosolids that come out of the wastewater treatment plants then gets applied to farmers' fields as a fertilizer. Cattle graze on those fields, take up the PFAS, especially in dairy cattle. It gets concentrated in the milk, and that milk would not meet standards. It would not be able to be sold. And I don't want to go too far off text, but there was a dairy down in New Mexico that had to euthanize a 1,500 head barn because the water that he was using to water his cattle with had PFAS in it, and no one would buy his milk because it had PFAS in it. So, even though, and I don't want to get too far off text here, but this is the serious part of this. It's in the food chain, or it can be in the food chain. No one's testing for it, though, because it's a chemical that we weren't even regulating up to a few years ago. So, I'm going to move on now, but it's in the air. It's been put on the ground through emissions up in northeast part of this country. There are acres, miles of ground that have been impacted with PFAS that have percolated down to the groundwater, and the residents there were drinking the PFAS. So that's how circular and big this issue is. So, in Kansas, we usually wait for the federal government to come out with standards. Like I said, in northeast and western part of the country, the states didn't think EPA was moving fast enough, and they promulgated their own standards for drinking water because they had residents drinking it, and yet there was no federal law to implement, so the state went ahead and passed their own state laws. But now we do have a federal standard for drinking water for some of the chemicals. It has also now been listed as a hazardous substance, which now kicks it into Superfund cleanup actions. And also it's now going to be a hazardous waste here shortly. We see it coming. And so we will have to start handling any outfall from industry as a hazardous waste and properly disposed. Those are all things that are really is either done or coming. Other things that EPA are looking at, well, so what should the surface water quality standard be for PFAS, for human consumption, for fish consumption? Because we use streams for drinking water, so we need to know what's allowable there. People fish and eat the fish out of there. We need to know what's an allowable limit for them to intake through the fish that they intake. Wastewater treatment plants that are discharging. What are they going to be allowed to put into the stream since those streams are being used for fishing and drinking? Again, I hope you're starting to see how circular this is becoming. And again, we talked a little bit about the biosolids, which is one of those things that is going to be an interesting discussion once we get there. Landfill leachate, all this material that you throw away ends up in the landfill. So we have sampled a landfill just to see what those concentrations in the water that comes out of the landfills are, and it's pretty high. And then also now it will shortly become a hazardous air pollutant. And so we'll have regulations to start looking at how many tons of PFAS is being put out by our industries. We know they have been, we just don't know how much because they weren't regulated. So therefore we weren't even tracking them. So for drinking water, right now, like I noted earlier, there are thousands of PFAS chemicals. Right now we have standards for 6 of them. EPA is busy working on more and more every year, but right now we have a standard for 6 of them. And the second bullet there is what I want to call to your attention. The drinking water standard for those compounds are 4 to 10 parts per trillion in drinking water. And that's an incredible number. We used to measure things in milligrams per liter, parts per thousand. Then we went to parts per billion. Now we're into parts per trillion. And I'll talk about it later. When they start looking at human consumption targets, it might be quadrillion, which is the next lower limit. We can't even measure it. So basically, if we see it, it's going to be too much. So for our drinking water systems, they're doing monitoring now, and they have to be in compliance with the new standards for these 6 chemicals by April of 29. So EPA's been doing some preliminary monitoring for PFAS to see where it is and what levels they are. And they've sampled 40 of the utilities here in the state through their program. And right now they've only identified two cities in which they're going to have to treat their drinking water because it exceeds their standards. I just do not tell you which 2. I know that's what everyone wants to know, but I'd prefer not to tell you which 2 cities are going to be working on this. So let's talk about the other end of the plumbing, from drinking water to the wastewater side. What does this mean? Industries are going to have to, who have chemicals that have PFAS in it, aren't going to be able to discharge them to the sewer system anymore. They're going to have to pre-treat that material out of it so it doesn't go to the wastewater treatment plants. We're going to have to start having monitoring requirements on our wastewater plants and industries that discharge to streams. We're going to have to start knowing how many pounds or tons of this are they putting into the rivers and streams every year. Surface water quality standards, like I said, we need to set these standards. We're waiting for EPA to set them because, again, we tend to want to follow what the federal rules are because we don't want to be more stringent than they are. But those will be coming out in the next year or 2. And like I said, the bottom point there, once they start considering the human health criteria in all these different avenues of exposure, those numbers could be driven down even farther because they are looking at a human contact or an ingestion number in the parts per trillion. And that's kind of, or quadrillion, which is really the wild card in all this because some of the standards that they set, if they are still exceed the quadrillion number for human health, we may have to even go lower. So moving on. PFAS in wastewater, right now it meets, most of the discharges we see do meet the standards for what we initially thought they were. But again, that wild card is when we have to start backing into the human number. So far, we've been doing some sampling just to see what it's like in Kansas. Hit the button once too many. So far, for source water, for our drinking water, we've only found PFAS in Clinton Lake. So if you live in Lawrence, I'm sorry. So here's some of the monitoring information that we've been out sampling our surface water just to see if we have it, and if we have it, where it is and at what concentration. It's pretty preliminary numbers, but I want you to look at the non-detects on that map. There are very few. I think there's only a couple. So we are finding it in most of our streams. Not at real high concentrations, but we are finding it. But there are a couple red dots on there. And those red dots are the things that we will start looking at as to what is causing these red dots. Lakes and wetlands. Again, this is just a snapshot of what the sampling we've done to date it looks like. And again, there you don't see very many circles that filled in, but again, most of them are pretty low level. But we do have one red one up there in Riley County. Fish tissue, again, preliminary sampling just to see what things look like. And most of the fish that we've sampled do have some level of PFAS in them. PFAS does bioaccumulate, so once it is ingested, you do excrete some out, but you do retain some in your body. And this is what we're seeing with the fish. And the fish, it's in their muscle, so it's something that it would be consumed. Next one is, I just want to spend a little bit of time with the biosolids. The graphs there on the right side of the screen shows a couple wastewater treatment plants and the amount of PFAS that comes into the treatment plant. The right side, the smaller bar, is what is being discharged to the stream. So what this tells us is that difference between the high bar and the low bar is what's going into the biosolids. And it's those biosolids that are being hauled out of the wastewater treatment plants and have been applied to farmers' fields as a fertilizer for 60 years, and still are. Which, if it's a field that has received numerous applications of biosolids, we're naturally going to see more PFAS there than we will at ones that have only used it periodically. Where we see the issue with PFAS on the soils is that if it's a grained, if we're growing corn or wheat or something like that, it doesn't look like the PFAS makes it into the grains. It's in the leafy part of it. So the issue is the people that use it for haying or have used it for hay, the grass will bring it up and put it into their leaves. You cut those leaves off, you feed them to your cattle. That's the exposure route for the cattle. Also, since you've put it on your soil, if it's a sandy soil, it will percolate down and get into the groundwater. Or it will run off if you have a runoff event on your. All right, so here's some of the things that are going to be complicating, and that's just that human health number and how that might have to back up into some of these standards that we send out. Another issue is KHEL has stood up the method to look at PFAS in drinking water because all the municipalities are going to have to start sampling for it. So we stood that up so that they could continue to send their samples to KHEL and get results. But we have not stood up the method, EPA method, to looking at things like biosolids, soils, fish, because that's a whole different method and it's going to be expensive. So I talked about the landfill leachate, where all of our material goes for long-term storage. The leachate out of there has been fairly high. And in the biosolids, again, there's some numbers there on some of the biosolids were 6,000 parts per trillion, which is way above any standard that we would have. All right. I know everyone's excited now. I can see the smiles around the table. But again, this is informational for now. KDHE Cleanup Authority comes from it being a hazardous substance and so forth. We have many contaminated sites around this state that have been going through the cleanup process, been doing soil removal, groundwater cleanup, things like this. We never sampled for PFAS. It wasn't regulated. We didn't even know about it really. So where we thought we had sites close to being closed, Responsible parties thought they were almost done or are done. Now we have to ask the question, did that company use PFAS? Did they control it? Did it get away from them? Is it in the groundwater? Where we thought we had protected the residents of the state that were using that groundwater as drinking water, we might not have with this new chemical. That groundwater plume might have gone past everything we were monitoring and have impacted additional residents. So here's another confounding part of this. EPA has exempted different communities from being responsible for this. So a city is not going to be responsible for the wastewater that they might have discharged to the stream. And I agree with that. They didn't know. How can we hold them responsible for that? So EPA's used some of the enforcement exemptions and said, we're not going to make farmers responsible for the biosolids that they put on their ground. They didn't know. So then the question comes down to, okay, when we do this, we're going to find this stuff. Who's going to clean it up? Who's going to pay for it? It's a great question. I don't have an answer for it. Is it going to be really expensive? Probably. So there's the dilemma. That's why I wanted to get in front of you so you could kind of understand where this is all going. So I was going to let you know a little bit what we're looking at just to get started with this. One, we have a document that we use for our cleanup standards called the Risk-Based Standards of Kansas. Those are our cleanup numbers. We're going to have to update that book with the new cleanup standards as they come out. We're going to have to perform some background studies in our urban areas, sorry. We know that we have had emissions coming out of the stacks of our facilities for many, many years. That has settled in residential yards. I feel very confident that I can guarantee that. I have no idea at what concentrations. Is it above what children should be playing in? I can't answer that, but I think there's a good chance the answer may be yes. So we're going to have to do some type of a background study to see what is out there. We don't know for soils. Looking at our contaminated sites, which I kind of talked about, where we thought we were done or almost done or being protective, we're going to have to now start looking at those again and say, did we miss it? Is it there? Or we need a sample for it? Did the company use the chemicals? So it's going to start. You may hear from industry that KDHE is making a sample for PFAS now. Now you understand why. What is most concerning is the orphan site program, where the state has taken over the responsibility for the cleanups because the responsible party no longer exists. So now the state has these sites that we're going to have to look at and say, is there a potential? If there is there an impact? So the bottom line there, what's the cost of all this? I have no idea. I have no idea. To industry, to the state, EPA doesn't have the funding to address this. And at a national level, we're all kind of scratching our heads going, we've created this new initiative. We want to be protective of human health and the environment, but the paying for it is going to be the most difficult part of all of this. So things that we can help is we can help the municipalities monitor their drinking water. We will have to adopt the MCLs. There's no choice about it. It's a federal standard. We have to adopt it. Utilities will have to come into compliance with those standards. We would like to stand up method 1633 so we could start doing our own soil sampling and testing, because sending this out to labs, lead time is incredibly terrible and incredibly expensive. We can do it cheaper inside. And then, like I said, those areas that have red dots on those maps that I showed you, we're going to have to get in there and figure out what's causing it. So those are the things that we will be spending our time on, trying to figure out the source of those red spots on those streams and lakes. And with that, I believe I'm done. It won't advance, but I'm done with the presentation. So I will stand for questions, Chairman, if you think I have time. If not, I will sit down. I went a little over, and I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Any good questions? Representative Blacks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Leo, for that. Are you looking forward to retirement?
I am. I'm very much am, because this is a new horizon.
I guess a question with this difficult chlorine and carbon bond that's so tough. What kind of research, to your knowledge, has been done that, you know, enabling it to break down? And a case in point, I know the city of El Dorado, and I assisted them a long time ago doing a polishing wetland, nature's kidneys, so to say, to be able to break that down before they release their wastewater effluent into the river. Has any research been done on the process and how we can break this down?
There is a, sorry, Chairman, there's a lot of research going into how can we biodegrade this material, because that would be the best solution. So far, it's not looking good. It looks like activated carbon and resin will take it out. There's a new technology called flotation, which they actually bubble water or air through a tank of PFAS-laden water. That PFAS tends to turn into a foam, kind of like when you push soap into your sink. It actually creates a foam at the top. They then scrape that foam off the top of the water to really concentrate the PFAS into that. Instead of having a 20 parts per billion in the water, it concentrates it down to just PFAS. And it might only be a cupful, right? Then they take that cupful and then there is a way to destroy it now. It used to be could be incinerated at very, very high temperatures, but now they have what they call supercritical oxidation method, which will actually destroy it. Nothing along any of these lines is cheap. So they're looking for something better, faster, cheaper, but so far the research hasn't shown it.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Simmons on WebEx. Are you there?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, sir. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this presentation. It is so fascinating. I have been hearing a lot about this just generally in the news. I'm so glad that you took the time to tell us about this. Is there a state that you think is on the right track that perhaps in our free time we should research or look into?
Yeah, without a doubt, there are states ahead of Kansas on this because, again, Kansas tends to wait for federal rules to come down and standards, but because without that, without them being regulated, we can talk to an industry and say, hey, you have a problem, but we can't enforce anything. So we wait for these chemicals to become a hazardous substance, a hazardous waste, or an MCL to be for the drinking water. That's what allows us now to move forward. Definitely Minnesota is ahead of us because that's where the 3M factory was, and they've been dealing with this for years. Over on the East Coast, where DuPont had a large factory, they've been dealing with it for years. And then New Mexico is dealing with it because of the dairy farm down there. And then in Northeast, there was a tent manufacturing facility up there where they put this on the tents to make sure they wouldn't catch on fire. It has impacted large areas of the Northeast, and they've been dealing with it. They've come up with state standards for milk for an example. What's an acceptable level in milk? The problem with that is if you're a person purchasing that milk, their number is 0. They do not want milk with any PFAS in it. So even though you might have it below the standard, you can't sell it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Representative Vaughn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You've successfully made my anxiety skyrocket this morning, Leo. But thank you. I do think this is a really important and emergent issue that is critical for human health for us to address. So thank you for the work that KDHE is doing to stay on top of it. The one question I was wondering, so you talked about groundwater, but it wasn't necessarily in your slides. So I was just wondering, is this one of the chemicals that's being tested for our forthcoming groundwater quality monitoring network, just so that we can get an idea where it is in our groundwater? I know irrigated water use, it looks like, and then of course domestic water wells are not going to be regulated for PFAS, but I think it's good for public information for people to know if they have it in their water. So I just wanted to know what the plans are around groundwater.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we want to get the program up and running, you know, because we just restarted that program. But yeah, I think it's a good idea to have it as one of the constituents. I'm going to say that we're probably going to see it more around the cities. But wherever the biosolids were applied, and we're trying to get a map as to where all the municipalities have put those, then that might reach into more of the rural areas.
Thank you. Yeah, I can reach out to KGS too. I would be interested for that to be included, so I can talk to them. So thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Leo. You almost ruined our Tuesday morning for us, or Thursday
I
morning.
was going to say, well, if it's
so
your Tuesday
confused.
morning, I went way in the future there, or way backwards.
Anyway, it's good to see what some of the emerging situations that we're going to have to deal with in the future. So,
Right,
Water
and-
Committee, much more to come in the future, I'm sure.
Right, and that's why I wanted to let you know about this, because in the future, we are going to have to deal with this. And we didn't want to be here a year or two from now, and that would be the first time you've heard of this whole situation. So we wanted to let you know what's going on.
Thank you, Leo. Appreciate it. At this time, I would like to open a hearing on Senate Bill 58, modifying the requirements and allocations of the multi-year flex accounts. And I'll call on Kyle to give us a briefing of the bill and a fiscal note soon from Heather.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 58 would amend KSA 82A 736, which relates to multi-year flex accounts. This statute is part of the Kansas Water Appropriation Act. A multi-year flex account, or a MIFA, allows water right holders to obtain a 5-year term permit that allows the water right holder to exceed the holder's yearly authorized quantity of water so long as the total pumping over that 5-year period does not exceed the 5-year authorized quantity. Enrollment in a MIFA is voluntary, and at the end of the 5-year term of the MIFA, the water right returns to its original conditions unless extended. So Senate Bill 58 would modify the MIFA quantity allocation calculation. Current law provides that the quantity of water deposited in a MIFA is the greater of either 500% of the base average use of the water right, which is calculated from the amount of water diverted by an applicant from the year 2000 to 2009, or 500% of the product of the county's net irrigation requirement multiplied by the flex account acreage multiplied by 110%. In lieu of these multiple allocation calculation options, the bill would provide that the calculation for the MIFA quantity allocation would be 500% of the product of the county's net irrigation requirement multiplied by the base water rights authorized acreage multiplied by 110%. Senate Bill 58 would make conforming amendments throughout the statute pursuant to that allocation calculation amendment. The bill makes technical amendments, and it also reorganizes certain provisions of the statute. So you're going to see a lot of stricken language throughout. Additional substantive amendments contained in Senate Bill 58 include the following. Costs of the administration of the program would be paid from the Water Appropriations Certification Fund instead of from MIFA fees. And currently, the term permit fee for a MIFA is set at an amount not to exceed $400. Provisions relating to penalties would be stricken from the statute, and language would be added to state that the chief engineer may adopt rules and regulations to implement, administer, and enforce the section. But do keep in mind that elsewhere in the Act, KSA 82A 737 creates civil penalties for violations of the Kansas Water Appropriation Act. And again, the section that's being amended by this bill is part of that act and subject to that civil penalty statute. The MIFA report to the legislature would be provided every 4 years instead of every year. Senate Bill 58 would become effective upon publication in the statute book. With that, I'd be happy to take any preliminary questions.
Any questions for Revisor Hamilton? Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Kyle. So the authorized quantity provided under the MIFA, what this bill does, or to back up, it used to be either historical use or the base average use or the net irrigation requirement, and this is making it so that it's only the net irrigation requirement.
Correct. There were a list of different ways to multiply or come to that amount. It's on page 3. You can see all the subclauses on like lines 32 through 43. And so, yes, it would consolidate the method of calculation to the one I stated.
Thank you. And then one more, if I may. So the other thing that kind of caught my attention for the cost of the administration of the program, if they're not using the MIFA fees, do you know where those MIFA fees will now be going?
The language of the bill doesn't expressly state what the fees would be used for now.
Okay, I can ask the proponents. Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none. Oh, Representative Sywert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I tried to read through that, and the calculations are kind of tough for an old country boy like me, but is this to help save water, or is this going to increase the usage for those guys?
From what I understand, the underlying purpose for having the 5-year period is they can't use any more water than they otherwise would have been allowed to over that 5-year period. But they're able to use more in any given year if they hadn't been part of this multi-year flex account. So that's kind of the flexible element of it. They could use all of the 5-year amount maybe in 1 or 2, 3, 4 years. But I think our conferees can maybe help give you a better answer.
Seeing no other questions, Heather, can you tell us about the fiscal note?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. According to the fiscal note prepared by the Division of the Budget on the bill as introduced, the Kansas Department of Agriculture and Kansas Water Office indicate enactment of the bill would have no fiscal effect on agency operations.
Okay, any questions on that? Seeing none, we'll go to oral proponents. And first on the list is Jackie Gargiola with the Kansas Livestock Association. And please correct my pronunciation of your last name.
Very, very close, Garagiola. So if you're familiar with Joe Garagiola, same pronunciation as the baseball player. So that's usually where I get people. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today on behalf of the Kansas Livestock Association. I will say I may defer back to the department on a lot of technical questions. I'm here today as a proponent on behalf of our 5,700 members, most of which are actually stock water users. And this does apply to irrigation as opposed to stock water, but there are many of them that also have irrigation rights. And we actually have policy supporting the multi-year allocation system for water permitting. And so happy to support this, this bill, but would probably not be the technical expert on this issue. But happy to stand for questions, and I'll keep it really short today.
Any questions? Seeing none?
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe's daughter. We will, that's easier for me to say, I'm sorry. Next up is Lane Letourneau with the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Thank you, Lane.
You bet. Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity for this hearing. And it's good to see everybody, by the way. And for those that don't know me, I'm Lane Letourneau. I'm the Water Appropriation Program Manager for the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony and support, and Kyle did an outstanding job describing the bill, and I'm thankful that he went through the calculations, because that's why we're here to modify the multi-year flex account statute. And we're the agency that issues water right permits, including the multi-year flex account, the MIFA. And like Kyle described, it is a very powerful tool that folks can use to stay in compliance with their water right. If they get in a really dry year and they still have to make their crop, it gives them the opportunity then to get a 5-year allocation. It suspends the base water right. This term permit then provides for this 5-year allocation where they can use a little bit more in the extremely dry year, but then balance out that management over the next 5 years. And so based on what Representative Sywert asked, when we look and do the analysis on these multi-year flex accounts, we do not see an increase in use. And actually, when we enroll our irrigators into a 5-year allocation and they start managing the water use over those 5 years, we actually see some conservation. While this is not a conservation tool, it's a flexibility tool, we do get the benefit of a little bit less water use in these multi-year flex accounts. And also, if the year is extremely wet and the irrigator doesn't need to use their full authorized quantity, then they can enroll that wet year into the multi-year flex account and have the opportunity then to use that water if it becomes extremely dry in that 5-year period. It's a very good flexibility tool and a very good management tool. Now, through the many years of processing the MIFA applications, we've learned from the School of Hard Knocks on what works and what doesn't work. And we've hodgepodged that bill over the years. And that's why when Kyle says you'll see a lot of strikeouts, there's a lot of cleanup in this bill, just based on the different amendments that we've done. And so when we're getting away from past average use, because that just creates a culture of use it or lose it. I mean, we hear all the time that we'll hear a guy irrigating in December, and we'll contact that individual, and he'll say, well, I've got to keep my use up for when the groundwater management district starts a LEMA or the state comes in and does an intensive groundwater use control area. I've got to keep my use up for when the cuts come. And so that's why we just want to get away from past average use. Plus, it's a difficult calculation. People will have errors in their past average use. They'll have things, and so it's a lot to calculate that. And when we do our multi-year flex accounts, over 90% of them ended up being the net irrigation requirement anyway at the end of the day. So we are very comfortable with an average net irrigation requirement. That's normally about 70% of the authorized quantity on a water right. But it's what most irrigators use on an average year. I mean, they only pump what they need, and that is the net irrigation requirement. We're getting away from base acres. That's the maximum acres during the perfection period. We're going to authorized acres. And so it'll be an easy calculation from the net irrigation requirement, authorized acres, and then you need a little bit more water than just the net irrigation requirement. And that's why we've done the 110% of the net irrigation requirement. Those changes right there, and then also to the rules, it was the calculation and getting signatures was the most difficult thing for us in processing these multi-year flex accounts, which at the end of the process, they were all approved anyway. People wanted them, but it was just getting those done. And in a really dry year, we'll get 700 multi-year flex accounts. And it's the same environmental scientists that process the MIFA that process regular applications. And so that just affects our backlog. This will benefit our water users with an easy calculation. It still gives them the voluntary program. Is it cleaning up the statute? We're also cleaning up the regulations, and I've provided a draft of those regulations so the committee knows that we're working on them. And then to address the fees, we needed to clean that up in the statute because the fees are in our term permit statute, but they were also in the multi-year flex account statute, and they all go into our certification fee fund. And so we're committed to just using the certification fee fund and getting that language all tidied up. It all goes into our same fee fund. And then, like I wanted to address, we show that these do not increase use on a water right, but does provide the flexibility to our producers. And with that, I'll stand for questions. Yeah, thank you.
Any questions? Representative Hellwig first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious, you've run these MIFA programs before. What percent participation did you get in the past of your irrigators?
You know, very small. I mean, we'll have 700 multi-year flex accounts. We've got 30,000, 25,000 water rights. I'll have to follow up with the exact numbers, but it's a very small percentage of the overall irrigation water rights. But 700 in a really tough year.
Representative Pishney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Lane, thank you for being here. But I guess a kind of a two-part question, but it's a voluntary program, so the producer can, or irrigator can get in or out of the program, or help me understand how they enter, and if they found that wasn't the program for them, can they exit? How voluntary is it versus mandatory is the point of the bottom line of my question.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me use an example of an individual that bumps up to their authorized quantity. Because this happens, they have to make a business decision. Is it better to take the civil penalty and the 2-year suspension on the overpump, or is it better for me to roll into the multi-year flex account? So we'll work through that with the irrigator to see what's better for them. So it's 100% voluntary, and if they want into the MIFA, they file a term permit application. So they get the term, and all of them have been approved ultimately. So they file an application with the rate, quantity, place of use, point of diversion, just like any other term permit application.
And
and if they want out, absolutely. So we've let a few of them out, but then once they get out, we make sure then that the quantity that they pumped is taken out of at least the next year, so they don't have the opportunity then to double pump that water.
So, and a part of that is, and I didn't ask this specifically, but is there a penalty to get out, or they just simply, you go through that process that you just defined?
No civil penalty. They just can't pump the water they'd already pumped.
Right, yeah, okay. And then lastly, and you pointed to it with regard to the rules and regs, but it says in here, may adopt rules and regs to implement, administer, and enforce. And a lot of places in here with regard to this program, the shall word is used, and this is a place where may is used. And I was surprised about that didn't say shall have rules and regs. But do you think that causes any concern when there's a change of administration and so forth? The word may versus shall?
No, and that's a question for our lawyer that drafted these up. I apologize, but I personally don't have a concern with it because we want to do the right thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Vaughn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Lane, for your testimony. I have two questions. So going off the former representative's question, I'm just wondering why the enforcement section was changed. It looks like maybe, I can't tell if it was a Senate amendment or if that was the way the bill was proposed, but it looks like the existing enforcement structure is, I mean, yeah, I guess I'm wondering why that section was changed, if you know.
Thank you for bringing that up because, again, this bill had been hodgepodged over the years, and our civil penalty enforcement is in the Water Appropriation Act under 82A 737. So the enforcement for the multi-year flex account would fall under that umbrella. So our chief legal counsel didn't think it needed to be repeated in both statutes because we have that enforcement capability under the act.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then I was reading through the text and it looks like in the added, there's a lot of stricken language and then it's added back in. So one of the things that's added is if they don't use all of the water in their new term permit, that they can roll that over into a new multi-year flex account. Is that the practice right now or is that something new that's going to be done?
Thank you for bringing that up. That's the practice right now with cleanup language, because what we found, again, use it or lose it. They got to the end of their current MIFA, and there's a lot of quantity left over, and they went ahead and used it up that 5th year. So we wanted to provide them the opportunity for at least up to 1 year of allocation to roll that into the next multi-year flex account period, because the first part of irrigation during a season is a lot more important than the tail end of irrigation for the crop. And so once we provided that opportunity to roll that forward, then they just pushed that authority into the next multi-year flex account. And from us, that's just pushing wet water into the future. And so that water stays in storage and it's only used if needed. And it did away with another use it or lose it.
And then, but they can't exceed, of course, their authorized quantity in any given year still, is that?
Well, they can't exceed the overall 5-year allocation.
Got it, okay, okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Lane, appreciate it.
Yep, thank you very much.
Committee, there is written proponent. On my sheet, it says oral proponent written. Kent, do you want to come forward and give oral, or are you okay with written? Okay, that'll work fine. So we have Ken Askren from the Kansas Farm Bureau providing written proponent testimony. Are there any other proponents? Are there any other neutral on this bill? Seeing none, are there any opponents? Seeing none, are there any further questions from the committee members of any of our presenters? Representative Pishney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a question, but a very general comment. And Lane referred to it 2 or 3 times in his testimony with regard to the use it or lose it. And I appreciate the intent of trying to eliminate that mentality of use it or lose it. So, because that's been a huge issue over the years. So I appreciate that piece of this legislation.
Let me try to quickly restate something that I understood here. This is a conservation bill. as a producer, if you want to enter into this, and since we're using the base that we're currently using, rather than your historical average, that reduces a producer's intent to pump as much as they can, to have as large a number as possible, and also several other places in there. They have found that once people have entered these, and I don't know, I should have asked Lane how many people have gotten out. I don't think the number's very big. So we have 700 of 25,000 total out there. We'd like to encourage this to other people, and it makes all kinds of sense to me as an ag producer to be able to utilize the water on dry years more so than on wet years and be able to carry things forward. It isn't exactly a water bank, but it gives you a 5-year allocation rather than a single year maximum. So, Representative Droege.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying. How do we get more people involved? Do we need to do something to make it a little bit easier or harder to avoid it? Because what our main goal is to cut down water use, and we need more people to be involved. Is there? And I'm not an irrigator, so you guys in Western Kansas are going to have to catch me up on if this is a kind of, this looks like good legislation, but do we need to do more to encourage or push people?
Representative White.
A little history for the newer members on the committee. This bill is, we've heard it last year, and we lost the good man to the Senate that's been pushing it. And right now it's going out word of mouth. And that's kind of an exponent thing, you know, 2 people tell 2 people. And then out in the field, it's being talked about. So it's very new. That's why there's such a small number. But I really think people will get on board quickly as the word gets out. And I think one of the big things is to get this into law. And that will be a pipeline for everybody to talk about it. So I think what we do here will help a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I guess as an irrigator, I'll address it. It's everything we can do to streamline this, and that was kind of the intent of this bill, is to streamline it and make it easier to understand than the past legislation, to make it fit what the division is currently doing right now. And I think with more knowledge out there, more people will adopt this. It makes all kinds of sense that we allow something like this to for the irrigators out there. It is a conservation bill, in my opinion. It will save us some water in the direction we need to go. Representative Pishney.
I'm not like the previous 2 representatives, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a hobby irrigator versus the life irrigators or lifeblood irrigators. But I'm wondering too if testimonials somehow, and not legislated, I don't mean that, but through the organizations, and like with Lane, for example, because it kind of fits with what was just said. But if one person tells a story and it's a successful story, that will help bring that 2 to 4 or 5 that were referenced in just a minute ago. So I'd encourage in the organizations like Lane's to provide those testimonials, get the word out of where there's success in this program, I think is one way to increase the participation.
Thank you. Seeing no other comments, committee, do you have any wishes on this bill? Does anybody intend to bring an amendment for this bill? If not, I would sure consider emergency final action. Representative Droege.
I move we take this bill to emergency final action.
Is there a second? Representative Pickert. Okay. We will move to, I'm sorry, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. I will open up for comments on Senate Bill 58. Representative Blex.
You know, we've had a lot of discussion about conservation, and it's very important. It seems to be somewhat lacking, and I think as policymakers, this will allow that, and it looks like with the amendments to me in a fairly new bill, that will make the thing more flexible and more attractive to producers. So I think this thing will grow. So I think it's beneficial for us to get this thing out and get it worked. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions or comments? Representative Droege, would you like to make a motion? To move this bill favorably from the committee?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move this bill favorably from the committee.
Is there a second? Lots of seconds. Take your choice. Representative Pishney. Okay, it's been moved and seconded to move this bill favorably from committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion passes. Thank you very much. Since we have done our business that I had intended to, Sandy, would you introduce your guests? I'm sorry.
Yes, I will. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. The room filled up with seniors from Southeast High School who are in government class. Their teacher, Mrs. Howard, is in the front row here, and so they're here for the day. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for being attentive to a bill that maybe you have no idea what we were talking about, but we appreciate it.
Welcome to the House Water Committee. Most committees around here are run much better than this one, but we actually accomplish some business occasionally here. I started to say, since we have accomplished all the bills that have been sent over to us other than one, there's one sitting out there that says about reorganization of agencies. And I would like to take that up next session and see what the committee's wishes are on that at that time. As far as I'm concerned, next week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we have it listed as meeting on call of the chair. I do not intend to meet. I know you're all busy with your other committees and things that are going on and getting ready for final votes. So I appreciate your activity and your interest and enthusiasm. I've enjoyed this session. Thank you very much, and we are adjourned.